What do you actually know about the Woolworth Tower? That it was the tallest building in the world when it opened in 1913? A Gothic masterpiece? A beloved New York landmark? That's the tourist brochure version. Behind that celebrated facade, workers fell to their deaths from steel beams with no safety nets, earning half the union wage. Over $100,000 was siphoned through shell companies, and the man who bankrolled it all, $13 million in cash with no mortgage, did not want an office building. He wanted a cathedral to himself. The dark truth behind this tower begins with everything they left out of the story. What does it really mean to call something a marvel? The Woolworth Tower rose above Manhattan in 1913, instantly crowned the tallest building in the world. Newspapers called it a miracle in stone and steel, a Gothic spire that made the city's heart soar. Visitors craned their necks from the sidewalk, dwarfed by its 792-foot silhouette. Every inch of its terracotta facade seemed to promise progress, prosperity, and the relentless optimism of a new century. In the months after its opening, the press was breathless. The New York Times declared the tower a triumph of American ambition, a monument to the spirit of enterprise. Postcards and guidebooks spread its image across the country. The lobby glowed with marble and mosaics, bronze angels holding lanterns aloft. At night, electric lights blazed from hundreds of windows, turning the tower into a beacon visible for miles. For many, it was more than a building. It was the city's new crown, proof that New York had surpassed London, Paris, and Chicago in its race toward the sky. Tourists lined up for the observation deck, paying a dime to gaze out over bridges, smokestacks, and the churning harbor. The Woolworth name, once synonymous with five and dime stores, now stood for something grander, something almost mythic. School children learned about the Cathedral of Commerce, a phrase that appeared in advertisements and editorials alike. The tower became a symbol of hope for immigrants who had crossed oceans, a sign that anything was possible in America's greatest city. Yet even as the city celebrated, the building's grandeur masked a more complicated story. The tower's fame grew, its image stamped on coins and souvenirs, its silhouette etched into the city's collective memory. But the story told in those early years of unbroken progress, of glory earned and deserved, was only part of the truth. The Woolworth Tower dazzled the world with its height and beauty, inviting everyone to look up and believe. But what was left unseen, hidden behind the soaring arches and shining glass, would challenge everything people thought they knew about this icon of the skyline. What stories slip through the cracks when a landmark becomes legend? Tour guides point out the marble mosaics, the bronze angels, and the dizzying view from the top floor. They recite the official line, "The Woolworth Tower was built with cash, the dream of a self-made man, a beacon for the city." But how much of that is true, and how much is carefully curated myth? Step off the velvet ropes and into the archives, and the record grows less polished. For every glossy brochure, there are ledgers and letters that tell a different story, one that rarely makes it into the tour script. Permits filed under company names that never appear on the building's cornerstone. Board minutes that reference expedited approvals and special arrangements with city officials. Correspondence between Frank Woolworth and architect Cass Gilbert shows Woolworth urging secrecy about financial backers and pushing for cost-cutting measures behind the scenes. The details do not match the narrative of pure, heroic ambition. Some documents contradict the legend outright. A 1910 letter from Woolworth to Gilbert hints at the lengths he would go to keep the financing structure hidden. He wrote, "Let us not invite public curiosity as to the means by which the work is accomplished. Payroll ledgers list names and wages that do not align with the union rates the company boasted about in public. Permits show amendments and addenda filed at odd hours, with signatures from city clerks who later appear in campaign finance records. Even the building's ownership on paper weaves through a tangle of shell companies and holding firms designed to obscure who really controlled the project's purse strings. There are gaps, too. Missing pages, redacted entries, files removed from official archives. The deeper you look, the more the story resists easy answers. Why would a man so eager for fame want parts of his greatest achievement clouded in secrecy? What did he stand to lose if the full story came to light? For every monument that rises, there are shadows beneath its foundation. The Woolworth Tower's public face is all light and grandeur, but its paper trail leads into territory that most never see. The records suggest a different kind of monument, one built as much on omission as on ambition, and one whose true cost is written not in stone, but in the gaps that remain. What does it take for one man to carve his name into the skyline? Frank Woolworth didn't just want an office building, he wanted a monument. In private letters, he called it Cathedral of Commerce, a phrase loaded with both pride and ambition. Money was never the obstacle. According to the company's own ledgers, Woolworth poured $2.25 million of his own cash into the project, recorded bluntly as founder's capital. That was nearly a fifth of the tower's total cost, a personal stake that dwarfed the investments of his board and partners. This wasn't just business. Woolworth's correspondence with architect Cass Gilbert reads more like a campaign for immortality than a set of construction notes. He wrote that he wanted a name that would outlive his own breath, echoing the kind of legacy talk usually reserved for kings or conquerors. He demanded that the tower rise higher than any rival, that it be visible from the harbor, and that it announced the triumph of a self-made man. The building's grandeur was calculated. Every arch, every spire, every marble mosaic was a line in the story he wanted the world to remember. But the way Woolworth financed his dream was just as strategic as the design itself. He limited his exposure to debt using a blend of personal equity, company debentures, and carefully negotiated bank loans. The debenture prospectus, sold to New York's financial elite, promised a quick return on investment, so every design flourish had to answer to the bottom line. When Gilbert pushed for a more ornate crown atop the tower, Woolworth cut it down by 25 feet, saving $250,000 in steel. The message was clear. Beauty was welcome, but only if it served the monument's main purpose, profit and prestige. Board minutes from the time show Woolworth insisting on the involvement of established financiers like J.P. Morgan's syndicate. He wanted the building to be more than a personal trophy. It had to be woven into the power network of New York's elite. With high-profile tenants lined up and city permits fast-tracked, Woolworth's money didn't just buy stone and steel. It bought influence, speed, and the illusion of a self-made legend. Yet for all the glory attached to his name, the record shows a man obsessed not just with building up, but with controlling every detail, especially the story told about him. The tower would stand for generations, he believed, as proof that ambition could conquer the sky. But what did it cost to build a monument to ego, and who paid the price for Woolworth's vision? That answer would be written not in ledgers, but in the lives of the workers who labored and sometimes died in the shadow of his dream. What gets left out when we marvel at a skyline? The Woolworth Tower dazzled the city, but the real story runs through the lives of men who risked everything to build it. On a cold morning in January 1912, Michael O'Leary, a 19-year-old Irish immigrant, climbed the scaffolding on the 30th floor. The wind whipped around him as he carried steel braces, his hands raw from the cold. Minutes later, he lost his footing and fell 45 feet to the concrete below. The coroner's report listed the cause as absence of protective netting and unsound timber, a technical phrase that barely hints at the violence of the moment. O'Leary's name appears only once in the company's records, a single line in a ledger marked casualty. For every polished marble floor and stained glass window, there were hundreds of workers like O'Leary, most of them recent arrivals from Ireland, Italy, or Eastern Europe. Their days started before dawn and stretched into the night, 12 hours at a time, 6 days a week. The pay was meager, $2.50 a day for general laborers, $3.50 for bricklayers, well below the union minimum. Payroll registers show systematic deductions, with workers losing up to 15% of their promised wages. Union contracts called for overtime pay, but company records reveal that overtime hours often went unpaid. In February 1911, the union filed a grievance accusing Woolworth's contractors of unfair overtime and unsafe conditions. The response was swift and cold. A brief wage bump came for a handful of workers, then business as usual. The risks were constant. Scaffolds collapsed, explosives misfired. In May 1912, an explosion killed a 19-year-old Italian laborer, Giuseppe Romano, when a demolition charge sent a chunk of facade into the street. The city's inquest found that the required safety protocols had been ignored to save time and money. Insurance payments went out, but families received little more than funeral costs. The company's liability insurer paid $85,000 in settlements across the 3 years of construction, but most workers' families saw only a fraction of that sum. These men built a monument that would never bear their names. They lived in crowded tenements, ate meals from tin pails, and watched as the tower rose above a city that often looked right past them. As the marble angels were hoisted into the lobby and the stained glass caught the morning sun, the stories of O'Leary, Romano, and hundreds more slipped quietly into the background. The Cathedral of Commerce promised salvation through progress, but for those on the scaffolds, the price of ambition was measured in lives, not ledgers. What does it mean to call a skyscraper a cathedral? In 1909, Frank Woolworth's publicists released a phrase that would echo for generations. The Woolworth Tower was to be a cathedral of commerce. The term landed in press releases and then rippled through editorials and advertisements, offering a kind of moral cover for a building that was, at its core, a monument to profit. Gothic arches, stained glass, and bronze angels were not chosen just for beauty. They were carefully selected to suggest permanence, virtue, even sanctity. The message was clear. Here was a temple not for worship, but for wealth. The language was powerful, and it worked. Early press coverage in the New York Times and the Tribune took up the metaphor eagerly, describing the tower as a secular sanctuary and a spiritual tribute to industry. Brochures mailed across the country called the lobby's marble mosaics the nave of a new faith and the soaring spire a beacon for American enterprise. Even the building's opening ceremony borrowed from church ritual, with speeches that praised not just the achievement, but the supposed moral purpose behind it. But who benefits when commerce borrows the language of the sacred? Woolworth's PR campaign was not just about selling office space. It was about transforming the image of capitalism at a moment when public trust in industrial tycoons was wearing thin. By cloaking his tower in religious imagery, Woolworth invited the public to see his pursuit of profit as a public good, his ambition as a kind of civic virtue. The building's Gothic details, modeled after European cathedrals, gave the impression of timelessness and moral authority, qualities that shielded its financiers and owners from criticism, even as workers toiled in dangerous conditions below. The phrase Cathedral of Commerce became a shield, deflecting scrutiny from the inequalities and risks embedded in the tower's creation. It also set a precedent, encouraging other Gilded Age moguls to frame their projects as gifts to the city, rather than as engines of personal gain. In the end, the metaphor did more than elevate the building's profile. It helped rewrite the story of who deserved to profit and why. The Woolworth Tower's reputation as a civic monument was built as much on clever branding as on stone and steel, blurring the line between faith and finance, and leaving behind a legacy that is as complicated as the city it towers over. Who really decides which dreams get built in New York, and who gets left waiting outside the doors? The Woolworth Tower's rise wasn't just a story of vision and cash. It was a masterclass in knowing the right people at the right moment and making the right promises behind closed doors. In June 1910, while most developers slogged through months of red tape, Woolworth's application for his record-breaking skyscraper sailed through the permit board in record time. The official minutes from that month mention a special review for the Woolworth Committee, a phrase that rarely appeared for anyone else. On paper, the process looked routine, but a closer look at city records and campaign ledgers tells another story. Woolworth's name shows up in the donations records for Tammany Hall, the Democratic machine that controlled nearly every city office at the time. The sum was $150,000, funneled discreetly into the party's campaign fund just weeks before the permit was approved. That figure, enormous even by Gilded Age standards, did not appear in public until years later when a city budget analysis flagged it as an unusual private contribution. But the timing was unmistakable. Permit board members with Tammany ties signed off on the building's plans, and the project skipped the usual waiting list. The city's own building department minutes note a fast-track review requested by the mayor's office, a courtesy rarely extended to rival developers. This wasn't just a matter of paperwork. In early 20th century New York, Tammany Hall was the real gatekeeper. Without their blessing, a project could stall for years. With it, doors swung open and obstacles vanished. Woolworth understood the game. He wasn't content to rely on personal fortune or architectural ambition alone. He leveraged the city's political machinery, greasing palms and forging alliances that would guarantee his monument rose above the skyline, no matter the cost to fairness or transparency. While the public marveled at the tower's height and beauty, the machinery of privilege ground away behind the scenes. The men who signed the permits, the party bosses who collected donations, and the financiers who stood to profit all shared in the spoils. For ordinary builders, smaller developers, and the city's working poor, the lesson was clear. Progress was reserved for those with the right connections and enough cash to buy a seat at the table. The Woolworth Tower became a monument not just to ambition, but to the quiet bargains and backroom deals that shaped the city's future. The real story of its creation is written as much in campaign ledgers and permit minutes as it is in stone and steel. Beneath the marble and gold of the Woolworth Tower, the real story was inked in ledgers and secret memos. In 1912, as the building soared skyward, an auditor hired by Woolworth's own board began to notice discrepancies buried in the construction accounts. D.K. McClure and Company, the general contractor, reported paying full union wages, but the payroll ledgers told a different story. Workers, many recent immigrants, were paid less than the company claimed. The difference, quietly pocketed, accumulated to $120,000 over 2 years. In the Manhattan of 1912, that sum could buy an entire city block. The auditor's search led to a shell company, W.H. Consolidated. Officially, it supplied steel pipes and building materials. In reality, it existed to siphon money back to those controlling the project's finances. Audit documents revealed that McClure's project manager arranged a kickback of 3% on every steel order, routed through W.H. Consolidated. The real supplier, Bethlehem Steel, never saw these extra charges. Instead, W.H. Consolidated billed the project at inflated prices, then funneled the surplus to a small circle of insiders. The trail of evidence climbed higher. Letters between Henry Wright, owner of W.H. Consolidated and a close Woolworth associate, and the project's financial overseers left little to the imagination. A memo dated October 1911 spelled it out. As agreed, the 3% will be distributed per our schedule. No further questions. The audit's findings were clear. A system designed to extract profit from every ton of steel, every length of pipe, every paycheck meant for men working 100 feet above Broadway. When the audit leaked to the New York Sun in July 1912, headlines asked, "Skyscraper's secret profits, who pays the price?" Public outrage followed, but the company's response was swift and quiet. Woolworth's lawyers negotiated a settlement, repaid part of the overbilled funds to the union, and issued a carefully crafted apology. No charges ever stuck. W.H. Consolidated vanished. The tower kept rising. For every marble mosaic in the lobby, a worker's wage was docked. The Cathedral of Commerce stood not just on ambition, but on a foundation of fraud, one the official record still struggles to face. Whose vision truly shapes a city's skyline, the artist or the man with the checkbook? Cass Gilbert, celebrated for his soaring public buildings, arrived at the Woolworth Commission with a portfolio full of cathedrals and capitals. But in the shadow of Frank Woolworth's ambition, even a master architect found himself bending to the will of commerce. Gilbert's early sketches imagined a crown that would rival the spires of Europe, an intricate 70-foot lantern of stone and steel meant to lift the building's silhouette above every rival. Yet as scandals over payroll and kickbacks swirled, the pressure to cut costs grew unrelenting. A letter from Gilbert's diary, dated January 1912, captures the moment. Woolworth's money built the tower, but his ambition built the myth. I have learned to shape stone to the rhythm of finance, not merely to the music of architecture. The numbers tell the rest. The tower's crowning element was trimmed by 45 feet, a decision that saved $250,000, enough to quiet investors and restore confidence after the audit's fallout. Ornamental stonework on the upper floors gave way to mass-produced terracotta. Even the lobby's marble mosaics and stained glass, once sketched in lavish detail, were simplified to fit the new budget. Gilbert's correspondence with Woolworth reveals a series of concessions, each one a small surrender. The floor plates, originally designed as cathedral-like naves, were carved into larger, more rentable bays. Decorative arches shrank, and the rhythm of the facade became less lyrical, more utilitarian. Some features survived, the bronze angels and the stained glass skylight, but even these were pared back, their grandeur measured against the bottom line. The result was a building that wore the mask of a cathedral, but bore the fingerprints of compromise. Gilbert, who once dreamed of a structure that would inspire awe, instead found himself balancing the demands of art and the hard calculations of profit. The Woolworth Tower rose as a monument not only to ambition, but to the uneasy alliance between beauty and money, a lesson written in every truncated spire and every line of the architect's weary hand. What happens when a single building becomes the yardstick for an entire city's ambition? After the Woolworth Tower claimed the title of world's tallest in 1913, New York's skyline transformed almost overnight. The press began calling it the Gothic Barometer, a phrase that captured the new arms race among developers. Suddenly, every major company wanted a spire that could rival Woolworth's, or at least borrow its aura of power. In 1924, the owner of the Bank of Manhattan put it plainly: any new headquarters must either echo Woolworth's cathedral or risk being seen as a mere office block. The message was clear: height had become a form of currency, and the Woolworth Tower set the exchange rate. Developers lined up to outdo one another. The Singer Building, once celebrated for its 612-foot height, was quickly overshadowed. The Metropolitan Life Tower scrambled to expand, and within a decade, blueprints for the Chrysler and Empire State Buildings were already in circulation. Each new project measured itself against Woolworth's 792-foot record, not just in steel and stone, but in the language of prestige. The city's zoning board began fielding petitions for height waivers, with architects citing the Woolworth precedent as justification for pushing ever higher. But this race had consequences beyond architecture. As towers soared, the gap between those who commissioned them and those who built them grew wider. The Woolworth Tower's legacy was not just a matter of vertical feat. It was a catalyst for a new era of competition where ambition meant more risk, more pressure, and more lives spent in the shadow of someone else's dream. How long does a name last in the shadow of its own monument? Frank Woolworth died in April 1919, just 6 years after his tower opened its doors. The New York Times ran a front-page obituary calling him the self-made magnate whose vision reshaped Manhattan's skyline. They praised the building as his lasting gift to the city, a structure that would outlive its creator by generations. For a brief moment, his name seemed as solid as the stone and steel he left behind. But memory is fickle, even for men who build cathedrals to themselves. In the years after Woolworth's death, the tower's fame only grew. Postcards still showed its spire piercing the clouds, and guidebooks called it the Cathedral of Commerce. Yet the man behind the tower began to fade from public view. By the 1930s, Woolworth's five-and-dime empire was already losing ground to new competitors. The chain's red and gold sign remained a fixture on city streets, but the story of the man who dreamed up the world's tallest building slipped quietly into the background. The contrast is sharp. The building endured, a permanent fixture in the skyline, while Woolworth's own reputation softened into legend, then into obscurity. His obituary promised a legacy set in stone, but the city moved on. The tower became a landmark, a backdrop for 1,000 stories that had nothing to do with the man whose initials once crowned its peak. As years passed, the line between monument and memory blurred, leaving a question hanging over the marble lobby. Does a name carved in stone guarantee remembrance, or does time always wear it away? What do we really see when we look at the Woolworth Tower, a cathedral in stone, or a ledger in disguise? The ornate facade with its pointed arches and bronze angels seduces the eye into believing in a higher purpose. But behind every carved detail lies a calculation, a balance sheet hidden in plain sight. The building's Gothic flourishes were never just about beauty or inspiration. Each decorative line, each marble mosaic was weighed against the value of rentable square footage and the promise of higher returns. The spire may reach for the heavens, but the foundation is pure commerce. Frank Woolworth understood the power of appearances. He insisted on a lobby that would awe visitors, but only if the expense could be justified by the prestige it brought and the rents it attracted. Cass Gilbert's sketches, once filled with soaring vaults and intricate tracery, were trimmed and simplified whenever costs threatened the bottom line. Even the stained glass and bronze angels served a dual purpose, elevating the building's image while signaling to investors and tenants that this was no ordinary office block, but a place where money itself was sanctified. The result is a building that invites worship, but not of the divine. Here, the sacred and the profitable are fused together, making it easy to forget what the stonework conceals. The Woolworth Tower's beauty is real, but so is the ledger it hides, a reminder that every marvel comes with a price, and every monument is also a mask. Who really owns the sky above New York? For a century, the Woolworth Tower promised the city grandeur and progress, but the doors to its highest floors have always been tightly controlled. In 2012, a new chapter began when developers signed a 99-year lease and set out to transform the tower's upper reaches into private luxury. The top 30 floors, once reserved for offices and public viewing, became 115 condominiums, some priced above $20 million. Floor-to-ceiling glass replaced steel-framed windows, and private sky lobbies now serve a handful of owners, while most New Yorkers are kept at street level. This transformation did not happen quietly. The Landmarks Preservation Commission granted a variance, allowing sweeping changes as long as the lobby and exterior remained untouched. Preservationists argued that the spirit of the Cathedral of Commerce was being gutted, its marble angels and stained glass reduced to set dressing for a building no longer meant for the public. Lawsuits challenged the developers, pointing to the original landmark designation's promise of public benefit. The result was a settlement requiring little more than a plaque and limited access to the lobby on select Sundays, a gesture that does little to offset the loss of public space. The tower's legacy of exclusivity has only deepened. Tax abatements meant to reward historic preservation now subsidize private amenities few will ever see. The observation deck, once a symbol of democratic aspiration, is now walled off. The story of the Woolworth Tower ends not in shared civic pride, but in a private sky, proof that even in the heart of the city, ambition and inequality still shape who gets to look down from above. What do we celebrate when we look up at the Woolworth building? Vision or vanity? Achievement or exploitation? Today, luxury condos crown the tower where laborers once risked everything for a wage that barely fed their families. The building still dazzles, but its shadows remind us. Monuments to ambition rarely honor those who built them. As the city keeps reaching higher, whose stories get enshrined and whose are forgotten? Join the conversation below.